Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Productions. I'm Conqueror's Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking the question of what if the Frankish Empire never collapsed? So as always with our videos we're going to give a little bit of a historical context for this, but the bonus question to this is going to be basically what have I got wrong, okay? And just fill up the comment section with all the things you think I've got wrong in this alternative history, because I don't often do this, but with regard to this video here, we're talking about something which happened in like 800, right? So you're talking about something which happened like 1200 years ago. There's undoubtedly going to be many things I've missed out. There's undoubtedly going to be many different butterfly effects which I haven't like thought about. So this comment section here, I want it to be filled with all the different things that you think, yeah, like kind of would have happened, yeah, and like be like, no, I think you missed this out, no, I think that, yeah. So please do that because this video here is quite an epic one. I almost didn't do it because of how epic I think it is. But yeah, so hopefully by the time I've explained the history of it and some of the backstory, you'll understand just what I mean by in terms of how much of an effect this has throughout world history. So we start our story with the fall of Rome, right? So this happened in roughly 476 AD. But of course, as with all things, it didn't just fall overnight. As the saying goes, Rome wasn't built in a day, and in the same way, it wasn't destroyed in a day, right? So what happened over several centuries was that there ended up being like decadence, right? So basically, the Roman elites end up basically, relying on slaves like to do all the work for them. They just party, and so basically like they kind of lost faith in the empire, and increasingly they end up relying on Germanic barbarians, to basically fill their military ranks. And obviously if you're basically importing what are essentially mercenaries, right? Mercenaries might be very good soldiers, but at the same time they have no loyalty to like kind of to the kingdom or to the empire that they're trying to defend, and so they end up basically just having like loyalty to the commander that they have. And so if they decide, right, we're gonna just go AWOL, then the men also go AWOL, right? So this is something which you kind of found towards the end of the Roman Empire, which is that many of the kind of like Germanic tribes, which the Romans were kind of like using to fill their armies, they end up turning on the Romans, right? And on top of that as well, you had like, the Huns that were moving through, like, Central and Eastern Europe. And this caused a lot of different kind of demographic displacement and stuff. So, you have the Slavs moving here, the Germans moving there, etc. So it's all kind of just a big mess and stuff, right? But what ends up filling the void, what ends up kind of finally officially getting rid of the Western Roman Empire is that these Germanic tribes end up basically conquering vast swathes of the empire, right? So, so when the Romans withdraw from Britain, you end up having the Anglo-Saxons who end up coming across, and they end up settling there. So England means the land of the Angles. So Angleland, England, etc., etc. Then you have the Visigoths who moved to Spain and stuff. Then you have, I believe it's the Ostrogoths or something. I can't remember the exact name, but I've got it on the screen now. And they end up taking over Italy. And then you end up having the Franks, right? So the Franks end up having a territory called Austrasia, right? So Austrasia means the Eastern realm, right? So Austria today in German means, it means Osterreich, which is like Eastern realm. So this is kind of like an Eastern realm as such, right? And so these Franks end up over time, over various different kings, and they end up and various different conquests, they end up expanding more and more until we get to King Charles the Great, right? Or Charlemagne, as he's more commonly known. So Charlemagne, he became the king of the Franks in 768 AD, and he, through various different military campaigns, as we can see on the map here, he ends up taking over more territory, and kind of building on and consolidating this empire that his forefathers had kind of built for him, right? So in 1774, he ends up taking over Lombardy. In 1778, he ends up taking over Spanish March, which we've discussed in our video on Catalonia, which, definitely check that out. So this is where he basically takes over the area of, which is now Catalonia. From 777 to 797, he ends up taking over Saxony. So this is this is his biggest campaign. So Saxony is basically where the Saxon came from, of course, and so there were many different like pagan groups here. And so one of the things he wanted to do was to kind of just crush them, because obviously people got to conquer and stuff, right? But also one of the things he wanted to do was to Christianize them as well, right? So this is a very long and very bloody war. Basically, what he ended up doing there was akin to what we say called like, you know, ethnic cleansing. You know, he ended up like, you know, taking a bunch of people here, moving it there, and then settling new people in here and just massacring people, etc., etc. Really terrible stuff, right? And this is often what you kind of see in like earlier times. Like we kind of think of like ethnic cleansing as like a new phenomenon. In actual fact, people have been doing it since time immemorial, right? But anyway, so this was a very long campaign that took like 20 years to subject like Saxony. And in 788, he ended up taking over Bavaria and Carinthia, right? So on Christmas Day, 800 AD, he ends up being crowned as the emperor by the Pope, right? Now, the Pope and the different kings of Europe had a lot of clashes during this time, so it wasn't a kind of clear thing where like, you know, the Pope was in charge or like the kings were in charge, etc., etc. They kind of kept like fighting for control. So in this instance here, the Pope was at a lower point, and so he basically tried to bolster his own legitimacy by crowning Charlemagne as the emperor, right? Then also Charlemagne basically used this as well to his advantage by basically being like, well, okay, cool. Like he wasn't even too bothered about it because it didn't mean that he got extra territory. He already controlled all these things, but it was a nice kind of gesture, yeah. And so as a result of this, he ended up becoming the emperor. So this is the Carolingian Empire. This is the Frankish Empire. So what ended up happening, right? You know, how comes there isn't one of these things today? Well, this is basically because of a strange quirk they have with regard to like inheritance laws, right? So basically what would be the case is that if someone died, what would happen is that their land and their territory would end up being split between their sons, right? So Charlemagne was lucky enough only to have like, you know, one major son and stuff, right? So he ended up like inheriting like all the kingdom. But then that person ended up having three sons, right? And these three sons, you know, in 840, so at the death of like Louis the Pious, so you had Charlemagne, then you have Louis the Pious, and like, yeah, so he dies in 1840. So there ends up being a civil war, which ravages the kingdom for 3 years. And then 843 AD, you end up having the Treaty of Verdun. Now, the Treaty of Verdun basically divides the empire three ways. And if you look on the map here, this is the division, right? Now, if you know anything about European geography at all, like if you know about the different linguistic groups, you know about, you know, the different, just the like the physical geography, like there in terms of mountains and rivers and stuff, it's quite clear that like, you know, the western like part of this, yeah, you know, West Francia makes some level of sense, East Francia maybe makes some level of sense. This middle kingdom here, this middle Francia, makes absolutely no sense at all, right? So by the time the Carolingian Empire finally collapses in 888 AD, what ends up happening is you end up having, you know, West Francia, Middle Francia, and East Francia, and there ends up being different wars and different like kind of territory being gained and different territory being lost by the different kings and stuff. But what ends up happening over time is end up being a consolidation of like these different groups. So West Francia in 987 AD ends up becoming the Kingdom of France, and this ends up having the capital in Paris, and this is how we have the modern state of France coming from, right? However, in 855 AD, Middle Francia ends up being split between the Kingdom of Italy and the Kingdom of Lotharingia. I think I pronounced that correctly, right? So, you know, so Lotharingia is here, and the Kingdom of Italy is obviously kind of in what's today like northern Italy, right? So you can kind of see like how, you know, the idea of France and eventually what will become the idea of Italy starts to kind of take root. And this affair lasts until 959 AD. And also East Francia in 962 AD ends up essentially becoming the Holy Roman Empire, right? So this is the beginning of, you know, as Voltaire said, you know, the empire that was, you know, is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, right? And it's just a kind of a cluster of multiple different competing kingdoms of just a complete mess. But the thing is, this is kind of the central building blocks for what we think of as a German identity, of an Italian identity, and a French identity. So what we're going to basically say now we've kind of covered the basic kind of history of it, is how would this have gone different, right? Kind of like, what, first of all, what would have had to have gone different for this not to have collapsed, right? And second of all, how would like world history have been completely different if this collapse hadn't have happened, right? So if they all stayed united, how would the history of Europe and world history have been changed? That's what we're going to get into now. So the first thing to note is that when I spoke earlier about, you know, a French identity, an Italian identity, and a German identity, the problem with a lot of like history is that it's kind of looking backwards at things, right? So if you start from the point of like trying to build a national story for the Germans or for the Italians or for the French, you look backwards through this kind of history and go, this is the founding of a French identity, this is the founding of a German identity, this is the founding of an Italian identity. But as all things, yeah, right, it's not like people specifically in those days went out of their way to be like, right, we're going to set up a German identity, a French identity, and an Italian identity, because these things simply didn't exist at that time. So the idea of nationhood is very, very recent, with the exception of England, which you could say is a possible like exception and stuff, right? Because England, you know, going back even before the time of like the Norman conquest and stuff, was for the most part a kind of consolidated idea of a nation state, right? So a common place where like there's a common language and like a common like culture and stuff. Although there's obviously various different dialects, etc., etc. But by and large, by like kind of the time of like Henry VIII and like the Protestant Reformation, you end up having more of a standardization of English, right? So that English text throughout the realm was by and large, you know, what was the official language. However, if we look at French, for instance, right, even at the time of the French Revolution in 1789, it's estimated that only about 12 to 13% of the population of France could speak French, right? And 50% of them could speak no French at all, right? So that's because you have all the different dialects in France. So what ended up becoming standardized French is actually what kind of was the dialect that was spoken around Paris, right? So this is the Ile-de-France, I think that's what it's pronounced as. French is terrible. So that ended up being the dialect that was chosen as, right, this is what standard French is, right? And so that dialect was then superimposed on the rest of France, right, as this is what standardized French is, this is what we're going to teach all the kids, this is what we're going to have as all the kind of newspapers and stuff. And so all the other languages, all the other dialects end up being suppressed over time. So these languages and dialects still do exist, but over time they've been largely kind of like suppressed, yeah, by like France, like in a kind of like centralized way. Similarly as well, if we look at Italian, so Italian unification only took place in 1861. And so what they end up choosing was the dialect around Tuscany, right? So Tuscan Italian, this ended up basically becoming standardized Italian. Similarly as well, if you look at German, so for instance, you have like High German, which is Oberdeutsches, I think, which is more spoken in like the south, so Bavaria, Austria, etc., etc. This is to do with the altitude, because you know High German because of like the Alps and stuff. So this is where like High German is spoken. In northern Germany, where it's obviously a lot lower, there's no Alps and stuff. This is called a Low German, or I don't know what the German for that is, Low German, right? But what ended up becoming standardized German was so-called Middle German, right? You know, so this is the kind of dialects which are spoken in the border places between, you know, Low and High German, right? So this is what became standardized German. So French, German, and Italian, as we can see, were not standardized languages until the 19th century. So the reason I kind of say this is because it gives you an idea of just how malleable languages are, right, over the centuries. And so different groups, especially in an era before like mass literacy and stuff, right, where only a handful of people could read and write. You know, before that time, whoever like the tiny elite were who decided what the language were, you know, they were the ones who could basically shape it for the rest of the nation. So it's not to say that people back in 800 would have done this, but over time, what one might have seen is more of a consolidation, yeah, between these different language groups. So, for instance, the kind of you know, the dialects which are kind of spoken on the border between France and Germany, which is, you know, for instance, like Alsatian, Luxembourgish, etc., etc. These are more likely the languages which probably would have eventually become the kind of standardized, whatever you want to call this language, you know, Frankish, right, whatever you want to call it. So that's something to kind of really bear in mind, that like, you know, of course, like the further away from this kind of borderlands you get, like, so the further into Germany you get, the more German the kind of dialects would be. The further into what's now France, the more French the dialects would be. The further into Italy, the more Italian the dialects would be, etc. But by and large, this would probably be the kind of cultural kind of like and like linguistic kind of like center point of this kind of Frankish empire, right? Just for simplicity's sake with this timeline, we're going to assume that there's no breakup of this group and that group, and because again, with regard to the rise of nationalism in the 19th century, as we saw with many different empires, they're not being torn apart, yeah, because of linguistic groups being wanting their own nation states. So assuming all that doesn't happen and that the borders of the Frankish Empire remain intact and there's no divisions and there's no conquest, etc., etc., assuming this, one would see a consolidation of the culture and language of these different groups. So how does this kind of tie in, with modern European politics? Well, as we've seen, especially within the last 500 years or so, is a huge competition between the different nations within this region, right? So France, as we've said before, at the time of the revolution, was the fourth largest country in the world by population. So it was only, I believe, China, India, and Japan, which had large populations. So France had, fourth largest. It had a population even larger than that of Russia. So absolutely huge, absolute behemoth. And so if we combined, France, Germany, Northern Italy, Catalonia, Austria, Switzerland, the Low Countries, etc., etc. If we include all of that together, that is a huge, huge population, right? So this Frankish Empire would be an absolute kind of behemoth, within Europe. So that's something to really kind of bear in mind, that the ideas, for instance, now of a European Union, of a kind of federal Europe, this would be a lot easier within this timeline, right? And actually, something to note as well is that the founding members of the EEC were France, Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries, right? So you can already kind of see how these are the kind of core nations of this idea of the United States of Europe. And certainly if the Frankish Empire had continued throughout this time, the idea of this would have been much it would have had even stronger of a kind of claim to it, right? So how is the rest of the continent going to be affected by this? Well, I think it's quite naive to assume that, with a population this big and with armies this strong and stuff, right, that it's not going to expand. If we look at Napoleon, if we look at Hitler, if we look at many different imperial groups that reigned during this time, dominance of the continent would pretty much be guaranteed. I don't think that there's many different rivals to them. Now we'll get on to England in a slight second, but I think you could pretty much guarantee certainly the borders here being maintained and stuff. I don't see any power being able to really crush this yet, unless there's internal divisions. I can't really see external power crushing this empire, right? So perhaps the borders of this go all the way to Russia or at least to Poland. And then do they take Spain or do they not take Spain? It's kind of, that's obviously up to interpretation. But I think certainly some of the kind of territories here that they have as vassal states would have been further taken. And I think, so quite a lot of kind of mainland Europe would have been taken. But as with most conquests of the European continent, Scandinavia oftentimes ends up kind of just being missed out a bit. And then also, of course, the British Isles. So this is where we kind of now are going to pivot more towards focusing especially on England, right? So England, is very much influenced by obviously, well, first of all, obviously they were founded by the Anglo-Saxons, right? But then obviously English has been very much influenced as a result of the Norman conquest, in 1066. Now, where did William the Conqueror come from? He came from Normandy. Where did the Normans come from? So the Normans were the descendants of Vikings who came down in 911 AD, I believe, right? So they basically, within our own timeline, they took advantage of the collapse of the Frankish Empire and basically seized the Duchy of Normandy for themselves. So over time, these Viking raiders end up becoming kind of subsumed by French culture, and so when they end up invading England, you end up having Norman French being highly influenced, right? That's why English to this day has about 29% of its words coming from French, and so it kind of gives you an idea of just how much of a kind of influence this place had. So there's so many different things, there's so many different butterfly effects, but I think broadly speaking, if there was no collapse of the Frankish Empire, would there necessarily have been Vikings who could have gone and taken Normandy and then later on William the Conqueror to have invaded England? I think it's unlikely. I think more likely than not, if there was a William the Conqueror of this time, he probably would have been a Viking, right? And actually, with regard to 1066, William the Conqueror was lucky in many ways that he was able to be successful there, because he decided to invade England, and in the same year as Harold Hardrada had invaded as well. So this was one of the Viking kings, so he was from Norway, and he wanted to take over the English throne. But Harold Godwinson, who was the king of the English, went north, crushed them at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. So that was the end. That marked like the end of the Viking era in England, right? However, upon having this victory, he then hears that William the Conqueror has just invaded in Hastings, right? So he then has to march his troops all the way down, and then he then has to fight the Battle of Hastings. He ends up losing, gets an arrow to the eye, and that's when you have the beginning of like the Norman conquest. Like they take over much of like England, and they completely change the social fabric of it, like the political system there. So under the Anglo-Saxons, you had a lot more kind of limited government. You had a lot more kind of like of a kind of more democratic kind of system and stuff. And so you basically had all that replaced with feudalism, and basically put like kind of English democracy and English liberalism back, several centuries basically. Yeah. So up until the time of Magna Carta, you basically had a kind of absolute monarch rule in England, and this is basically as a result of William the Conqueror in 1066. So English, the very language I'm speaking to you in right now, would be unintelligible had this timeline gone differently. So if the Frankish Empire hadn't collapsed, it's very, very likely that the English which I'm speaking to you in now would be far more akin to like Dutch or Danish, which in our own timeline, like English is most common to like Dutch or Danish, like kind of when compared to different languages, but it would be even more influenced by this and even less influenced by like French and and by Latin. Now, of course, England and France basically just like cats and dogs throughout the centuries, right? They're always at war with each other. But it's something to note that although France had almost 3 times the population of England for for most of like that history, still France wasn't able to invade England and conquer it, right? So even if at some point, because of these extra men and extra resources that they'd have from the Frankish Empire, even if they invade at a much later time, if they don't invade in 1066, then English like culture and English language, etc., would be fundamentally like changed, like simply by the fact of the Normans not invading in 1066. And there's every chance that there never is an invasion of England from like the continent in that way. So this would mean that if we think about like the modern age, we think about the age of empires, this is where it starts to get really messy, people. So it's to keep it very, very simple. So let's just assume that you have the British Empire as it was, and you have the French, the Dutch, the Belgian, the German, and the Italian empires all combined, right? Now, unless I've done the maths on this incorrectly, but if I remember correctly, this is the situation. So if you combined the British Empire and you have it compared to all of the territories of like the places I've just listed, right? It still is a situation where the British Empire would still be the largest empire the world's ever seen, both by population and by area, right? So in terms of area, the fact that Britain has Canada and Australia means that it's very much like bumped up. And the fact that they have India means that in terms of population, it's just, it's not even a question. So something to kind of note here that although this territory here on paper would be like huge, it still would be a situation whereby the British Empire would still on paper have been larger than it, right? But something to note that obviously if you think about the Napoleonic Wars, if you think about World War One, if you think about World War Two, think about the huge cost it took for England to crush these kind of like continental hegemons, right? It was an uphill struggle even then, even with like them being disunited. If they were united, it would have been it would have been almost impossible to to have defeated these people in battle, right? So that's kind of something to kind of bear in mind, right? So just to make it so that this timeline just doesn't become completely ridiculous, I have to stop here, right? Now, obviously in the comments, as we said, the bonus question is, what have I got wrong? Please let me know in the comment section what I've missed out and stuff. And yeah, I'm very interested to hear what you have to say for this. This obviously covers a wide range of European and world history, and obviously the butterfly effects of this are massive. There's probably so many things I haven't even thought about which would have been directly affected by this. But yeah, so definitely let me know in the comment section what you think of it. And yeah, so the next video is going to be on what if Reconstruction had succeeded. So definitely stay tuned for that. This is obviously, you know, after the Civil War in America and what happened to the former slaves. You know, so what if the federal government had continually like, you know, protected their interests afterwards? You know, so that's what the next video is going to be about. But if you like this video, I know obviously it's covering a lot of like history and it's like quite in-depth stuff. But if you like this video and you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to obviously hit the like button, obviously subscribe if you haven't already. We've just passed 1,600 subscribers. And also as well, check out our other videos as well. We've got a whole range of them. Share them with people. Don't forget, sharing is caring. And also as well, just to let people know who are new to the channel, we are coming to the end of the alternative history series. So in the next few months, we are going to be moving on to film reviews. So we're going to be looking at all different films. We're going to be looking at like Disney films, etc., etc. Then we're going to be moving on to more classic films like Godfather and etc., etc. So definitely stay tuned for all of that. And in the meantime, have a great day and bye.